In the remote region of Alsace, nestled in the shadow of the thick forests and rolling hills, a family once lived whose very existence would become a whispered legend. Their tale is one of isolation, fear, and a dark superstition that set them apart from the rest of the world. It's a story that begins with a peculiar detail, one that seems almost trivial at first glance, yet reveals something much deeper. The family, for reasons unknown, never used mirrors. It's not simply that they avoided them. Mirrors, reflective surfaces of any kind, were completely absent from their lives. No glass, no polished metal, no reflective pools of water, nothing that might show them their own image. This seemingly strange habit would remain a mystery for centuries, leaving people to wonder what had driven them to such lengths. Was it an unfounded superstition, a belief that seeing one's reflection was dangerous, or something darker? Perhaps it was born of the fear of the unknown, the fear of confronting what lay beneath the surface, both literally and figuratively. After all, this was a family that lived in seclusion, shunned by neighbors, and whose unusual practices bred rumors and suspicion. But could there have been more to their fear than mere folklore or superstition? In the late 17th century, the world of science and medicine was still in its infancy. The concept of genetics was a far-off mystery, and the study of hereditary conditions was only beginning to take shape. People didn't yet understand the biological consequences of inbreeding, nor the profound effects it could have on a family over generations. And yet, this family from Alsace seemed to know, in some primal way, that their isolation had led them down a path that might define nature itself. Their fear wasn't born from the wild imagination of a few eccentric individuals. It was collective, ingrained in the very fabric of their daily lives. The avoidance of mirrors became more than just an oddity. It became a symbol of something much larger, something deeply rooted in both biology and superstition. Was it possible that the family, over time, had begun to see their own reflections as a harbinger of something sinister? Perhaps the side of their own faces, contorted by genetic mutations passed down through generations, was something they could no longer bear to face. Or maybe it was the fear of what they might see in each other, physical deformities, mental afflictions, or even the horror of seeing what inbreeding had done to their lineage. It's easy to dismiss this fear as mere superstition, as the product of a more primitive mindset. But what if there was more to it? What if the family's avoidance of mirrors was an early form of self-preservation, a way to shield themselves from the painful truth about their genetic fate? In an age when disease, deformity, and death often struck without warning, perhaps the family had found a way to cope with a fate that they couldn't escape, something that science was only just beginning to uncover. To understand this family, we must first delve into the history of the region where they lived. Alsace, during the late 1600s, was a land caught between worlds. Situated at the crossroads of France and Germany, it had long been a place of political and cultural turmoil. Religious and political conflicts raged, and the people of Alsace, already accustomed to hardship, had little room for tolerance when it came to what they didn't understand. In this environment, the family's strange behavior wasn't just an isolated quirk, it was a reflection of the fears that ran deep within the society of the time. In 1684, the family's household would have been a curious sight indeed. A secluded home, perhaps a small cottage, tucked away from the prying eyes of the nearby village. It's likely that the family had always kept to themselves, either by choice or by necessity. In an era when rumors spread quickly and superstition ran rampant, it's possible that the family had deliberately distanced themselves from others, not just because of their fear of mirrors, but because they were viewed as different, even dangerous. The people of Alsace, like most of Europe at the time, were steeped in a mixture of religious fervor and superstition. The church held great influence over the minds of the common folk, and the fear of the supernatural was very much alive. Diseases were often seen as divine punishments or the work of witches, and deformities were sometimes attributed to curses or the will of God. But what of those who could not be explained? What of those who were different in ways that defied belief, whose very existence seemed to challenge the natural order? It's no wonder that a family like this, living on the edge of society, would become the subject of suspicion, gossip, and fear. In the absence of understanding, people often resorted to myth and superstition to explain what they could not comprehend. The family's refusal to use mirrors would have been seen as an ominous sign. Perhaps they were hiding something, perhaps their very reflections were cursed. After all, the idea that one's image could hold supernatural power was not unfamiliar in the folklore of the time. Mirrors were often thought to be windows into the soul, capable of revealing hidden truths or even trapping one's essence. To avoid them completely was not just a matter of preference, it was a statement, a declaration of fear. But was their fear entirely unjustified? Inbreeding, the practice of marrying close relatives, was not uncommon in isolated communities during the 17th century. Without the understanding of genetics, the consequences of repeated intermarriage were largely unknown. The family's peculiar avoidance of mirrors could have been the result of a deeper, more primal understanding of the dangers that inbreeding posed. Perhaps they recognized, even subconsciously, that their physical appearances were slowly being altered by the generations of intermarriage. Faces that had once been familiar might have started to look strange, distorted by the accumulation of genetic anomalies. The fear of confronting this reality could have driven them further into isolation, creating a vicious cycle of avoidance and secrecy. To this day, the story of the inbred family of Alsace remains one of the most unsettling and perplexing mysteries of the period. It's a tale of fear, not just of the unknown, but of what lies within us. The mirrors that the family avoided may have been more than just objects. They could have been symbols of self-awareness, reflections of a dark truth that the family was too terrified to face. Their story, shrouded in secrecy and fear, raises questions that linger long after the facts have faded into the shadows of history. How much of what we believe is rooted in superstition, and how much is based on something deeper, something instinctive, that we are only beginning to understand? Perhaps, in the end, the family's fear of mirrors wasn't so irrational after all. Perhaps they were the ones who saw something that the rest of us still refuse to acknowledge. In the late 17th century, Alsace was a region steeped in complexity, caught between the influences of France and Germany, each vying for control and shaping the local culture in different ways. Nestled on the fringes of the Holy Roman Empire, it was a land of political and social turmoil, where allegiances could change as quickly as the shifting borders. Despite this uncertainty, the people of Alsace were deeply rooted in their customs, traditions, and ways of life, ways that had been passed down through generations. Yet, even in such a historical context, there were mysteries that defied explanation, and one such mystery lies within the isolated family of our story. At the time, the idea of genetics as we understand it today didn't exist. The word itself would not be coined for another 2 centuries, and the study of heredity was only just beginning to take shape, albeit in rudimentary forms. The concept of bloodlines and inheritance was understood, but in a far more superficial way, through the language of family trees, nobility, and divine will. The people of Alsace did not have the benefit of modern science to explain why certain traits were passed down from generation to generation. There were no words for the biological mechanics at play, no understanding of chromosomes, recessive genes, or mutations. Instead, life was governed by the explanations provided by religion, superstition, and the local folklore that permeated every facet of daily existence. In this environment, deformities or unusual physical traits were often seen as signs from above, or from below. People didn't simply see a malformed body or a disfigured face, they saw the hand of God or the mark of the devil. A child born with a deformity was either cursed or blessed, depending on the interpretation, but never simply the result of inherited genes. Diseases, both visible and invisible, were often attributed to the wrath of God, or perhaps a divine test of faith. The understanding of genetics as we know it today would have been utterly foreign to the people of the time. But one thing they did know was that some families seemed to bear more of these burdens than others. And when it came to inbreeding, where family members married within their own bloodlines, there was an unspoken understanding that such practices led to something unnatural. Alsace, at the time, was still a relatively isolated region. Though it had many small villages and hamlets, communication between them was slow, and movement was even slower. Roads were often little more than dirt paths, and the concept of travel beyond one's hometown was a rarity for most. The idea of moving to a new town or marrying someone from another village was almost unheard of for many rural families. This sense of isolation, both geographically and socially, meant that family members often intermarried to preserve property, wealth, and social standing. The resulting genetic pool was small, and over time, the effects of such inbreeding began to take hold, though no one could have fully understood why or how. The family at the heart of this mystery, living in a secluded part of Alsace, was not unique in their practice of intermarriage. Yet, the peculiar fear they developed regarding mirrors points to something more profound, something that goes beyond mere isolation or superstition. To understand why they avoided mirrors entirely, one must first consider the social and cultural context of their time. During the late 1600s, most people had limited exposure to the physical realities of disease, deformity, or genetic variation. Public health was still a foreign concept, and families often had little understanding of the causes of inherited diseases or how genetic defects could manifest across generations. Yet, they did notice patterns. Certain families seemed to carry traits that were passed down from one generation to the next, often with tragic results. In the case of this particular family, it's likely that over generations, the effects of inbreeding began to manifest in a visible way. Perhaps there were physical deformities that began to emerge, mutations that might have been passed down through the generations, exacerbated by the close-knit nature of their marriages. For example, congenital conditions like cleft palates, scoliosis, or limb deformities may have been present, though it's impossible to know for certain. These genetic abnormalities might have grown more pronounced with each successive generation, to the point where the family began to notice that their physical features were becoming increasingly other. The fear of confronting their own reflection in a mirror, an act so simple for most, could have been a psychological response to these visible changes. The lack of understanding of genetics during this period would have exacerbated these fears. Without the ability to understand the biological basis for these changes, the family may have interpreted their own physical differences as a sign of something more sinister. Their faces, their bodies, became not just a reflection of heredity but a sign of their isolation, their fear, and their inability to escape their genetic fate. And this fear wasn't just about what they might see in a mirror, it was about what others might see. The fear of being judged, of being ostracized, was very real. In a world where appearance often dictated one's social standing and acceptance, the family might have feared that their increasingly peculiar features would mark them as outsiders, deserving of scorn or worse. During this period, in a world where medicine was rudimentary at best, it's also likely that the family's unusual practices, such as their refusal to use mirrors, might have stemmed from a deeply ingrained belief in the supernatural. In the absence of scientific knowledge, it was easy to fall back on folklore, superstitions, and religious beliefs to explain what could not be understood. Mirrors, in particular, were often viewed with suspicion. They were seen not just as reflective objects, but as portals, windows into another world, perhaps even into one's soul. The idea that a mirror could capture something more than just a reflection was a widely held belief across Europe. To avoid looking into one was, for many, a way of avoiding the potential to be consumed by one's own image. It was a fear rooted in the supernatural, in the idea that mirrors held a power that could not be controlled. The family's fear of mirrors, then, might have been compounded by both genetic realities and cultural superstitions. It was a way of avoiding the painful truth of their appearance, the genetic toll of inbreeding, while also guarding themselves against the imagined dangers that mirrors could represent. To look into a mirror was not simply to see one's reflection, it was to confront the darker side of their lineage, to face the consequences of their isolation, and to acknowledge that they were, perhaps, marked by something beyond their control. Alsace itself, with its rolling hills and dense forests, was a place where old beliefs held strong. Folk remedies, charms, and talismans were commonplace, and the supernatural was never far from the minds of the people. In this setting, the family's strange aversion to mirrors would have been understood as something more than a mere oddity. It was a manifestation of a deeper, unspoken fear, a fear that permeated not only their daily lives but their very sense of identity. The family didn't just avoid mirrors, they avoided confronting the truth about who they were, what they had become, and what their future might hold. In a society that had no concept of genetic inheritance, and where supernatural explanations were often the easiest to grasp, it's possible that this family's fear was a product of both their biology and the cultural landscape in which they lived. The avoidance of mirrors was not merely a superstition, it was an act of self-preservation, a way of protecting themselves from the unthinkable reality of their existence. The family at the center of this story, living in the isolated corners of Alsace, was no ordinary family. From the outside, they appeared much like any other small, rural household, secluded, hardworking, and self-sufficient, but there were undercurrents within their lineage that set them apart. To truly understand their lives, we must look deeper into the origins of their family, at the web of relationships, the interconnectedness of bloodlines that created the peculiar household we know only through rumor and scattered historical records. At the heart of the family's mysterious isolation was a long-standing tradition of intermarriage. Though marriage between close kin wasn't entirely unheard of in rural Europe at the time, especially in small, isolated communities where outsiders were few, this particular family had taken it to an extreme. For generations, they had kept their bloodlines as closed as their household, marrying within the immediate family or with distant cousins. It was a practice born out of necessity, as much as choice. In such a remote region, Where outsiders were viewed with suspicion and opportunities to form new alliances were scarce, intermarriage was often the only viable option for preserving wealth, property, and familial connections. But there were consequences to such practices, consequences that were not fully understood in the 17th century, but were nonetheless real. The effects of inbreeding, though not scientifically recognized at the time, were already being felt within the family, and they would only grow more pronounced with each passing generation. The family had become a self-contained unit, relying on one another for everything, from their livelihood to their social interaction. Inbreeding was the invisible thread that tied them together, creating a genetic tapestry woven with repeating patterns that would eventually begin to unravel. As generations passed, the physical and mental effects of their insular breeding practices began to manifest in ways that couldn't be ignored. The family's appearance began to shift. What was once a group of normal, albeit slightly eccentric, individuals gradually transformed into a community marked by physical anomalies. Facial features that had once been recognizable, even beautiful, slowly grew distorted. The children of one generation might have had a slight deformity, perhaps a cleft lip or a clubfoot, that became more pronounced in the next. And with each new marriage, the inherited traits became more pronounced, more inescapable. The genetic defects they passed down weren't merely physical, they were psychological too, leaving behind mental illnesses and cognitive impairments that seemed to run through the bloodline like a curse. As the family's physical form began to shift under the strain of their closed breeding practices, so too did their minds. The conditions caused by inbreeding, such as increased susceptibility to mental health disorders, cognitive decline, and even more extreme psychological conditions, began to take their toll. Perhaps some family members developed a deep-seated paranoia, a fear that the world outside their home would uncover their secret. Others may have suffered from more severe forms of delusion or mental instability, their minds fraying under the weight of their isolation and the genetic damage that had been passed down from generation to generation. As their physical forms became more alien to themselves and others, so did their understanding of the world around them. It is essential to understand that this family, by all accounts, was not isolated from society by choice. They had likely once been part of a thriving community, their ancestors having mingled freely with neighbors and outsiders. But over time, as the effects of inbreeding began to take hold, and as the family's peculiarities became more pronounced, they were forced to retreat further into the forests, away from the prying eyes of the village. In a time when superstition was rampant and religious fervor ruled much of daily life, those who did not conform were often viewed with suspicion. The family's increasing physical and mental differences became a social curse, one that pushed them further into isolation. It's likely that the family, faced with the stigma of their own genetic fate, retreated from the world, not just physically but emotionally and psychologically as well. The fear of being discovered, the fear of being judged, perhaps even the fear of being rejected by society, drove them to further distance themselves from the rest of the world. They built their home in a remote corner of Alsace, far from the village's watchful eyes, and became something of a ghost story. Their house was a place of whispered rumors and half-formed stories, a place where the villagers dared not venture. But the isolation, while keeping them safe from external judgment, only intensified the family's internal fears. As they turned inward, they could no longer hide from the reality of their own reflection. This is where the fear of mirrors, of reflecting back their own image, may have first emerged. With each new generation, as the family's physical traits became more pronounced, they likely began to see something that repulsed them in the glass. Perhaps it was a facial deformity, an asymmetry in their features, or the deep-set eyes that looked back at them with a strange, unfamiliar gaze. In a time when appearance held so much significance, the fear of what they might see in the mirror, of confronting the genetic consequences of their lineage, could have been too much to bear. It wasn't just that they might have been ashamed of what they looked like, they might have feared that their reflection was a sign of something more sinister. Was it possible that they saw in the mirror not just a physical reflection, but a symbol of their genetic fate, of the damage that had been done by years of inbreeding? Perhaps this fear of their own reflections was not just a matter of vanity, but of survival. For the family, who had already been marked by the visible and invisible effects of inbreeding, the mirror may have become a cruel reminder of everything they could not escape. It was a reflection not just of their faces but of their future, a future filled with the consequences of their ancestors' choices, choices that had bound them together in a genetic web from which there was no escape. And yet, this family was not alone in their struggles. Inbreeding, though not understood in the scientific sense during this period, was a practice that was still fairly common in isolated communities across Europe. For the family, the isolation wasn't just a social choice, It was a genetic necessity. With no outside marriages, no infusion of new genetic material to counteract the effects of their insular breeding practices, their fate was sealed. The pattern of inbreeding, passed down from one generation to the next, only exacerbated the damage that had already been done. By the time we reach the family story in the late 17th century, the effects of generations of intermarriage had reached their zenith, making it impossible for the family to continue without facing the consequences. Their life was a cycle, a closed loop that continued on and on, driven by the need to preserve the family name, the family land, and the family wealth. They married within themselves, their bloodlines narrowing with each passing year, until they could no longer see themselves reflected in the world outside. The family had, in a sense, become prisoners of their own genetics, a legacy that was passed down not through the pages of history, but through the very bodies that carried it forward. This was the family's fate, a fate shaped by the twin forces of isolation and inbreeding, each one feeding into the other, until they were left with nothing but the walls of their home and the reflections they dared not face. The family may have been driven by a desire to protect themselves, to preserve what little they had left in a world that was changing rapidly, but in the end, they found themselves locked within a genetic prison of their own making. The mirrors, once a tool for vanity or beauty, had become a symbol of the family's darkest fears, fears of what they had become and what they could never escape. The fear of mirrors, so ingrained within the isolated family of Alsace, did not arise from mere superstition or ignorance. Rather, it was a reflection of something far deeper, an instinctive, visceral reaction to a world they could not fully understand. It wasn't just that they feared what they saw in the mirror, it was what the mirror symbolized, a confrontation with themselves, with the truths they could no longer deny. The origins of this fear are elusive, hidden within the folds of history and psychology, but they reveal a profound connection between genetics, societal perceptions, and the human psyche. For a family so deeply entrenched in isolation, mirrors were no mere objects, they were gateways to something terrifying. In a time when superstition and religious fervor often dictated one's worldview, the idea that mirrors could capture more than just a reflection was pervasive. They were believed to be portals to the soul, capable of revealing hidden truths or even imprisoning one's essence. To look into a mirror, to see oneself reflected back, was to invite the possibility of seeing something darker, a soul corrupted, a body deformed, or even a glimpse of the future. In a world where the supernatural was always lurking just beneath the surface of daily life, mirrors held a fearsome power. For the family of Alsace, this power was something they could not, would not, face. It is important to remember that this family, living in a time of limited scientific understanding, would have had no concept of genetics as we know it today. But what they did know, or rather what they felt deep within their bones, was that something was wrong. Their bodies, their minds, and their family as a whole seemed to be marked by a cycle that they couldn't break. The consequences of their inbreeding had begun to manifest physically, deformities, physical abnormalities, and mental instability that only became more pronounced with each generation. But what was truly terrifying for them wasn't just the effects of these genetic disorders, it was the fear of seeing them laid bare, to witness them in a mirror, a stark reflection of their own decaying lineage. In the absence of any true medical understanding, the family may have attributed these visible differences to something darker. Perhaps they saw them as the result of a curse, or as a sign of divine disfavor. In such a context, the mirror was not just a tool for vanity, it was a harbinger of truth, and for this family, that truth was too painful to bear. Every time they gazed into a reflective surface, they were forced to confront the undeniable fact that they were different, marked by an inheritance that was both visible and invisible. The fear of mirrors, then, was not just about confronting their own physical appearance, but about confronting the entirety of their family's history, their genetics, and the terrifying knowledge that they could not escape the consequences of their ancestors' choices. But what exactly did they fear seeing? It's possible that the family, increasingly aware of the deformities and mental conditions that plagued their bloodline, began to view their own reflections with growing horror. Perhaps they saw twisted, misshapen faces staring back at them, faces that no longer looked familiar, faces that no longer reflected the human ideal they had once known. As the effects of inbreeding became more pronounced, it's likely that the family began to see in the mirror not just a reflection of their physical appearance, but a symbol of their genetic decay, a visual representation of the inheritance they could not outrun. The mirror, in this context, became a portal not just to the physical world, but to a psychological reality that was much more difficult to escape. For this family, it's likely that they began to see their own faces as an indictment of their entire existence. The more they looked, the more they saw not just physical differences, but signs of genetic failure, twisted, fractured images of the very bloodline that had kept them locked in a cycle of self-destruction. The more they avoided mirrors, the more the fear grew, until it became all-encompassing, a constant presence in their lives, lurking in the corners of their minds. There's an undeniable link between the family's fear of mirrors and the psychology of self-image. In a world where appearance often dictated one's place in society, the fear of being seen as other, of being marked as different, was profound. The fear of rejection, of social ostracism, was a driving force for the family's avoidance of mirrors. To look into a mirror was to risk seeing the very thing that could cause their social rejection, an image that did not conform to the societal ideal, an image that was distorted by the genetic damage that had been passed down through generations. In the 17th century, physical appearance was closely tied to one's identity and social value. The aristocracy, the clergy, and even the common folk placed significant weight on how they were perceived. Those who looked different, those whose features deviated from the norm, were often feared, ridiculed, or ostracized. A family that bore the marks of genetic deformity, especially one so isolated from the outside world, would have been seen as not just physically different, but morally and spiritually other. Their differences, magnified by inbreeding, would have marked them as outsiders in a world where conformity was often the key to survival. But there is another layer to this fear. It's possible that the family's avoidance of mirrors was also tied to a deeper, existential fear, the fear of confronting their own mortality, their own inevitable decline. To look into a mirror was to face the reality of aging, of degeneration, of the slow unraveling of one's body and mind. For a family that had already experienced the physical and mental toll of inbreeding, the mirror may have become a symbol not just of personal deformity, but of their inevitable end. In a world where death was always present, where disease and pestilence could strike at any moment, the fear of seeing that decay reflected back at them was a source of unimaginable terror. The absence of mirrors in the family's life, then, was not just a matter of superstition, it was a form of psychological survival. It was a way to protect themselves from confronting the brutal truth about who they had become, and what they were destined to become. The mirrors, which might have been used by others to examine their beauty, their youth, or their health, were for this family a source of constant, overwhelming anxiety. Each time they looked, they saw not just their reflection, but a future that they could not escape, a future marked by deformity, madness, and death. And yet, despite their avoidance, the family could not entirely escape the consequences of their genetic fate. The mirrors may have been hidden away, but their image was still there, etched in the faces of each new generation, in the twisted limbs, the disjointed features, the fragile minds. The family's greatest fear, confronting the truth of their inheritance, was inevitable. Even if they refused to look in the mirror, in a way, was always there, staring back at them from the faces of their children, from the whispers of the village, from the knowledge that they were trapped within a cycle they could not break. The fear of mirrors, then, was not just about vanity or superstition, it was a reflection of a deeper, more profound fear, the fear of being confronted by one's own self, by one's own genetic legacy, and by the inescapable reality that the past, no matter how hard one tried to bury it, always comes back to haunt you. For the family of Alsace, the mirrors were more than just reflections. They were windows into a truth they could never fully accept, but which they could never truly escape. The family's fear of mirrors, rooted deeply in their isolation and genetic peculiarities, is intertwined with the fundamental issue of heredity. While they lived in a time when the scientific understanding of genetics had barely begun to take shape, there was an unmistakable, primal awareness within the family that something was wrong. This awareness may not have been articulated in terms we would use today, terms like recessive genes, mutation, or genetic disorders, but the effects of inbreeding, which were beginning to take their toll on the family, were impossible to ignore. It was through these silent, unspoken experiences that the family's fear gradually transformed into something more than superstition. It became a biological reality they could neither understand nor escape. The family's long-standing practice of intermarriage had unknowingly set the stage for a series of genetic issues to unfold across generations. At the time, inbreeding was not universally condemned or even fully understood as the cause of various medical conditions. In rural, isolated communities like the one the family inhabited, it was not uncommon for close relatives to marry in order to preserve property, wealth, or social standing. With little access to outsiders, and even less knowledge of the biological consequences of breeding within the same gene pool, these families continued a cycle of isolation that was, in many ways, both a necessity and a result of their environment. But the consequences of this practice, although invisible to most of society, were becoming increasingly evident within the family. As the years passed, the manifestations of genetic disorders began to emerge in the form of physical deformities, cognitive impairments, and other traits that deviated from the so-called normal. The family began to exhibit what we now recognize as the clear markers of inbreeding, an increased likelihood of genetic abnormalities, congenital disorders, and neurological issues. Conditions such as cleft palates, club feet, skeletal deformities, and facial asymmetry may have been some of the first signs that the genetic pool was narrowing, becoming more homogeneous, and therefore more susceptible to the recessive genes that had been passed down through the generations. In addition to these visible physical conditions, it is likely that the family also experienced mental health issues tied directly to their limited gene pool. Many genetic conditions, particularly those stemming from inbreeding, can lead to an increased risk of developmental and psychiatric disorders. The family's mental health may have deteriorated over time, with increasing levels of paranoia, depression, and cognitive decline. It is entirely plausible that the isolation they endured, combined with the mental effects of their genetic inheritance, contributed to an atmosphere of fear and mistrust within the household. But the more these physical and mental traits began to manifest, the more the family would have recognized the consequences of their decisions. With each new generation, the signs of genetic damage would have become harder to deny. The fear of what they were becoming, what they were passing down to their children, would have been compounded by the awareness that they were trapped in a cycle they could not escape. The family might have begun to view their physical appearance not just as an inconvenience or an oddity, but as a direct reflection of their genetic fate, a fate sealed by generations of inbreeding. This, then, is where the idea of the mirror becomes even more potent. To look into a mirror was to confront not only the physical evidence of genetic degeneration but the existential terror of being trapped within one's own inheritance. Each face in the reflection, each feature that seemed slightly askew, became a visible reminder of the family's isolation and the decisions that had led them down this path. The distorted features staring back at them in the mirror would have been impossible to ignore, reinforcing the knowledge that their fate was out of their hands, that they were merely the product of a bloodline they could not change. What makes this even more tragic is the fact that, at the time, the family had no understanding of the science behind their predicament. The concept of genetics, though theorized by early scientists, was not understood in any meaningful way by the general public. The laws of inheritance, how traits are passed down through generations via alleles, genes, and chromosomes, were unknown to them. Even if they had sought out help from the outside world, there would have been no easy answers. No doctor could offer a solution, no religious leader could provide comfort, because the family's plight was tied to something far beyond their comprehension. They were locked in a biological prison, the doors to which had been shut long before they were born. It's possible that the family, in their increasing isolation, began to see their condition as something supernatural. If they could not explain the deformities and mental deterioration through the lens of science, perhaps they turned to religion or folklore to explain their situation. In a time when disease and deformities were often thought to be divine punishment or the result of curses, it's easy to see how the family might have viewed their situation as a form of punishment, both for themselves and for their ancestors. The supernatural fear associated with mirrors may have originated from the belief that they were being punished for their genetic mistakes, that to look into a mirror was to expose themselves to divine retribution, to see their punishment reflected back at them. The family may have even feared that the mirror could somehow trap their soul, capturing their essence in a way that would perpetuate their genetic curse. In a society rife with superstitions about spirits, souls, and mirrors, it was not uncommon for people to believe that mirrors held mystical properties. The idea that a mirror could capture one's soul, or trap a person's essence, was pervasive throughout Europe in the 17th century. In this context, avoiding mirrors may have been seen as a means of protecting themselves from spiritual or supernatural harm. The family may have believed that to look into a mirror was to look directly into their own cursed soul, to confront the reality of what they had become. However, while the supernatural explanation might have provided some comfort or a framework through which to understand their fate, the reality of the situation was far more biological and inescapable. The family's fear of mirrors, in the end, was likely driven by the recognition of the genetic consequences of their actions. They had lived in isolation for so long that they had no other recourse but to internalize the fear of their own reflection, and with it, the understanding that their genetic flaws could never be hidden, could never be erased. In the end, it was their bloodline, the very thing that should have brought them strength and continuity, that became their curse. With each generation, the family's genetic flaws grew more pronounced, more visible, and more difficult to ignore. Their refusal to look into mirrors was not just an avoidance of their physical appearance, It was a way of coping with the knowledge that they were doomed to repeat the mistakes of their ancestors, trapped in a cycle they could neither break nor escape. They had inherited a legacy of isolation, of fear, and of genetic degradation, one that no mirror could reflect, but one that would remain with them for as long as they lived. And so, the family continued their existence in the shadows, avoiding mirrors, and perhaps even avoiding each other in some ways. Their fear of confronting their own image was the ultimate expression of the helplessness they felt in the face of their genetic inheritance. There was no solution, no cure, no way to break free from the genetic web that had been woven long before their time. And so, they lived in the darkness, where their reflections could not haunt them, where they could pretend that the past had not come back to claim them. But deep down, they knew it had. The family's retreat into isolation, their avoidance of mirrors, and their increasingly odd practices reflect a broader fear, a fear that had permeated not only their lives but the surrounding community's perceptions. In a time when superstition, folklore, and the deep influence of religion shaped societal norms, the family became a pariah. In the late 17th century, society was shaped by rigid structures of belief, where anything that deviated from the norm was quickly labeled as dangerous, unnatural, or, in extreme cases, cursed. The family's fear was not only biological or psychological, it was also social, deeply embedded in the collective anxieties of a community that had no framework for understanding what was happening to them. Alsace, as a region caught between the influences of France and Germany, had long been a place where both cultural and political tensions simmered. But these external conflicts were not the only forces shaping the lives of its inhabitants. Within the smaller, rural communities, there was a quiet but pervasive fear of the unknown. The people of these villages, whose daily lives were governed by strict religious codes, superstitions, and deeply ingrained traditions, viewed anything that stood outside of these parameters with suspicion and disdain. The family's strange practices, their refusal to use mirrors, their peculiar isolation from the rest of society, only fueled this growing fear. At the time, those who deviated from the norms of behavior, health, or appearance were often seen as the embodiment of evil or divine punishment. In a society where the religious and the supernatural intertwined, abnormalities in physical appearance or behavior were often interpreted as signs of moral or spiritual failings. A malformed body, a peculiar trait, or a mental condition was not simply seen as a medical anomaly. It was a reflection of something much darker, an omen, a curse, or even a punishment from God. For a family that had been living in increasingly isolated conditions, the perception of them as cursed or damned was an inescapable reality. This view of the family was compounded by the secrecy that surrounded their home. In a world where social visibility and acceptance were crucial for survival, the family's retreat from society raised alarms. The people of the nearby village would have whispered about the strange household, fearful of what they could not understand. Rumors would have spread, as they always did, fueled by a mixture of suspicion, superstition, and fear. In a time when disease, deformities, and mysterious ailments were often attributed to witches, curses, or divine retribution, it wasn't difficult to imagine that the family was seen as harboring something deeply wrong. The avoidance of mirrors, combined with the family's increasing physical and mental decline, would have added to the aura of fear that surrounded them. What could be the cause of their strange behavior, their unwillingness to be seen or to show themselves? People who live on the edges of society, those who do not marry outside of their family, who live in isolation, who avoid even the most basic social norms, are often viewed with a mix of curiosity and fear. For the villagers, who had no understanding of genetics or the science behind the family's condition, it was far easier to explain the family's peculiarities through the lens of the supernatural. In their isolation, the family became a living embodiment of the town's darkest fears. They were no longer just an oddity, they became a symbol of everything that could go wrong when humans tampered with nature. The family's refusal to use mirrors, a seemingly small and harmless quirk, would have been seen as evidence of their deeper affliction. It wasn't just that they didn't want to see themselves, it was that they were hiding something terrifying, something that could not be explained. And in a world where the unknown was often feared, where disease and deformity were attributed to moral failings or curses, the family's isolation became their greatest curse. Perhaps even more troubling than the family's physical abnormalities and their avoidance of mirrors was the psychological toll it likely took on them. The fear of being seen, of being judged or ostracized, would have led to a profound sense of shame. This shame, compounded by the knowledge that their condition was the result of choices made by their ancestors, choices that had led them down a path of genetic degeneration, may have led them to withdraw even further from the outside world. They may have come to see themselves as outcasts, irredeemable and beyond help. In such an environment, the family likely began to see their isolation not just as a physical necessity, but as a mental and emotional safeguard. They feared what others would think if they were seen. How could they explain their deformities, their mental instability, or their strange behavior? And so, they retreated further into themselves, constructing walls not just around their home, but around their very identity. This growing sense of alienation would have been compounded by the family's inability to seek help. In a world where medical knowledge was rudimentary, where mental health was poorly understood, and where the stigma surrounding deformities was so strong, the family likely felt completely trapped in their condition. To seek help from the outside world was not just to expose their secrets, it was to invite the judgment and scorn of a society that would see them as cursed, as unnatural, as something to be feared. The family's isolation was, in many ways, a survival mechanism. The avoidance of mirrors was not just a superstition, it was a form of self-protection. By refusing to look at themselves, they could avoid confronting the truth about what they had become. They could hold on to the illusion that they were normal, that their condition had not worsened, that they were not marked by the sins of their ancestors. And yet, the more they avoided the mirror, the more their fear grew. Mirrors, in this sense, became a symbol of self-awareness, a way for the family to confront the truth about their physical and mental decline. But by avoiding them, they could continue to live in the shadows, sheltered from the harsh reality of their condition. At the same time, the family's strange behavior would have led to growing rumors in the village. In a time when belief in the supernatural was widespread, any unusual behavior was immediately attributed to otherworldly forces. The villagers may have begun to see the family not just as strange, but as dangerous. Perhaps they feared that the family's isolation was the result of some dark secret, one that could bring harm to the village. They may have feared that the family was hiding something truly sinister, something that could not be understood by the ordinary folk of the village. And in such a world, where the line between the natural and the supernatural was often blurred, the family became a symbol of that which could not be explained, feared because it stood outside the boundaries of everyday life. The family's fear, then, was not just a personal one, it was a reflection of the society they lived in. The fear of mirrors was, in part, a fear of being exposed, of being seen for what they truly were, a family marked by genetic deformities and mental instability, a family that had been shaped by years of isolation and inbreeding. But their fear was also a reflection of a broader societal fear, a fear of the unknown, of the unnatural, of those who did not conform to the expected norms. In a time when belief in witchcraft, demons, and curses ran deep, the family's strange practices were not just the subject of curiosity, they were the subject of dread. In the end, the family's avoidance of mirrors, their growing isolation, and the rumors that swirled around them reflect the complex intersection of biology, psychology, and society. The family was not just isolated by choice, they were isolated by their own biology, by the consequences of generations of inbreeding, and by the fear of what they had become. Their story is a tragic reminder of how deeply fear and shame can shape our lives, how the consequences of our actions can reverberate down through generations, and how society's judgment can amplify the suffering of those who are already struggling. The family of Alsace, whose story remains shrouded in mystery, were not just victims of their own genetics, they were also victims of a society that did not understand them, that could not comprehend the depths of their fear, and that ultimately cast them out, leaving them to face their fate alone. As the years passed, the family's isolation in Alsace deepened, and their fear of being discovered or exposed only grew more intense. By now, their lives were increasingly shrouded in secrecy, not just because of their oddities but because of the sinister myths that had begun to take root. The strange behavior, the physical deformities, and the ever-growing suspicion in the surrounding community seemed to reinforce the narrative that they were not just a family of outcasts but a living mystery, one that others could not understand and that they themselves had trouble explaining. In a time when medical knowledge was rudimentary, and the line between the natural and the supernatural was often blurred, the family found themselves caught between the twin forces of genetics and societal rejection. Despite their isolation, the whispers from the nearby village never stopped. The family's refusal to appear in public, their avoidance of mirrors, and the persistent rumors about their condition had made them subjects of morbid curiosity and speculation. They were now legends in the making, their names muttered in hushed tones, passed along as tales to frighten children, or to explain the unexplainable. In small, rural communities, such stories could take on a life of their own, with each retelling adding new, often more exaggerated details. Perhaps it was said that the family had been cursed by a local witch, or that their bloodline was the result of some unspeakable sin committed generations ago. These myths, though based on fragments of truth, distorted reality in ways that further isolated the family, pushing them into a darker, more mysterious realm. But what were the family members themselves feeling? It's likely that their growing isolation and the increasingly hostile or fearful reactions of the villagers took a heavy toll on their mental health. As the years went by, it's reasonable to assume that their paranoia grew, perhaps even to the point where they began to suspect that the villagers were watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake, or hoping for some sign that their curse was real. The very act of living in isolation, combined with their awareness that their family was marked by strange, unsettling traits, would have made them fearful not only of the world outside but also of themselves. If they truly believed that they were cursed, how could they have escaped the feeling that they were doomed to suffer forever? The mirror, after all, had become a symbol of that very fate, a reflection of everything they could never escape, a reminder that they had been irrevocably changed. Over time, the fear of rejection, of being judged by the outside world, likely overshadowed any hope they might have had for acceptance. This fear may have driven them deeper into the shadows, physically and emotionally. The avoidance of mirrors may have evolved from a simple reluctance to look at themselves to a profound psychological defense mechanism. The fear of seeing their deformities reflected back at them likely became intertwined with the fear of acknowledging their own sense of alienation and degradation. Perhaps, by avoiding their reflections, they could convince themselves that they were not as different, as marked by their family's history, as they felt. It was a coping mechanism, an attempt to protect their fragile sense of self from the painful truth that they were living in the consequences of generations of inbreeding. The family's refusal to acknowledge their reflection, however, was not the only form of self-protection. It's likely that they developed other strategies to cope with their growing sense of fear and shame. One such strategy could have been their increasing withdrawal from each other. As the family became more aware of their own defects, both physical and mental, they might have started to see each other as reminders of what they had become. In a household where the family members were closely related, often cousins, uncles, aunts, and siblings marrying one another, the boundaries between individuals likely blurred. They were all connected, not just by blood but by a shared history of genetic decline. In such a setting, it's possible that the family's emotional and psychological distance from one another grew. The fear of their own shared fate, of passing down the same genetic defects to their children, may have led them to see their own relatives with growing suspicion and dread. This isolation was not just physical but emotional. Living in such a closed-off household, with no external support, no community to offer any comfort or understanding, the family members must have felt trapped in a psychological prison. The idea that they were forever connected to one another by the same genetic thread, a thread that seemed to be unraveling with each passing generation, would have instilled a deep sense of helplessness. They may have even grown resentful of one another, not because of personal grievances but because each person was a reflection of the family's collective fate. This shared burden would have made it impossible to escape the dark reality that they were bound to one another in ways that were no longer healthy, no longer survivable. The family's need for self-preservation may have led them to turn inward even further, strengthening the sense of separation, both from each other and from the outside world. It is likely that, over time, the family members came to accept their fate with a kind of grim resignation. The myths surrounding them, the rumors that painted them as cursed or evil, may have further alienated them from their own sense of identity. They no longer saw themselves as a family in the traditional sense. Instead, they may have viewed themselves as something separate, something different, something irrevocably altered by the decisions made long before they were born. The weight of this realization, the understanding that they were not just different, but doomed, would have been a heavy psychological burden, one that compounded the fears and anxieties that already plagued their lives. By now, their existence had become a paradox. They were both the victims and the perpetrators of their own fate. Their genetic inheritance was both a product of their ancestors' choices and a force that had taken on a life of its own. The family's refusal to engage with the world around them was not just a response to social rejection, it was also a response to the terrifying reality that they had no control over the path they were on. In many ways, they had become prisoners of their own genetics, trapped in a cycle of genetic decline that they could neither understand nor stop. This sense of entrapment, of being unable to break free from their own inherited destiny, would have been one of the most devastating aspects of their existence. As their isolation continued, the family's condition likely worsened. The physical deformities, the mental instability, and the growing sense of fear and shame would have created a vicious cycle, each feeding into the other. The family's increasing separation from the world and from each other might have been their only way of coping, but it was also the thing that ultimately sealed their fate. The more they withdrew, the more the myths surrounding them grew, and the more their fear, of mirrors, of judgment, of the inevitable future they faced, took root. The fear of being seen, of being understood, may have eventually overshadowed everything else. They became the very thing they feared, a mystery, a curse, an enigma that could never be solved or understood, not by themselves, nor by anyone who might have come to their aid. In the end, the family story became one of quiet desperation, a haunting narrative of how genetic isolation, societal rejection, and a deep, unspoken fear can combine to create a life of unimaginable suffering. Trapped in their own history, their own bodies, and their own minds, they lived on the edges of existence, neither truly alive in the world nor fully dead to it. They had become a shadow of a family, a ghost story whispered on the winds of time. As the years dragged on, the family's existence in the secluded household grew more bleak, more surreal, and more entangled in both their own genetics and the oppressive weight of their surroundings. The increasingly bizarre conditions of their home, combined with their continued physical and mental degeneration, painted a picture of a family completely out of step with the rest of the world. But there was more to their story, more to their fear, than simply their isolation. The family story speaks to something far more insidious, the long-reaching consequences of genetic isolation and how it shapes not only the body but the mind as well. In a world where the science of genetics was unknown, the family would have had no way of understanding what was happening to them. But what they did experience, physical deformities, mental decline, and an overwhelming sense of terror, was more than just happenstance. It was the direct result of generations of inbreeding, a practice that had slowly whittled away at their genetic viability. And though they may not have had the language to describe what they were going through, they could feel it, feel the weight of each new deformity, each new mental breakdown, each new symptom of decay. These were not just visible signs of an inherited flaw, they were manifestations of something far darker, a descent into a state of genetic entrapment, from which there was no escape. As each new generation of the family came into the world, they inherited more than just physical traits. They inherited the psychological burden of being marked, of knowing that they were not normal and never would be. This psychological toll is perhaps one of the most devastating consequences of inbreeding, not just the suffering caused by the body's physical defects but the profound and often crippling effects it has on the mind. The fear that comes with seeing oneself, or seeing one's offspring, bearing the marks of genetic decline is something far worse than simply being different. It is an existential crisis. The family may have come to believe that their very existence was an affront to nature, a punishment for crimes they did not fully understand. The myths that grew around them, stories of curses, of divine wrath, of evil spirits, only served to reinforce this belief. To be born into this family was to be born with a mark on your soul, something that could never be washed away, no matter how hard you tried to hide from it. This fear likely affected every aspect of their lives. Even as they retreated further into their home, even as they closed themselves off from the world, the anxiety that plagued them must have been unbearable. What must it have been like to grow up in such an environment? To be born into a family so marked, so disconnected from the rest of society, knowing that you were fated to inherit the same genetic issues that had plagued your ancestors? The isolation and secrecy were not just physical but psychological as well. The family members would have lived in constant fear, fear of being seen, fear of what others would think, fear of their own reflections in the mirror. They lived in a constant state of tension, never fully able to relax or to feel safe, knowing that their very existence was a source of fear for others and for themselves. The deeper psychological effects of this fear would have been profound. The family may have become paranoid, distrustful of anyone who might come near them or seek to understand them. They would have been unable to trust the outside world, unable to believe that anyone could see them as anything other than what they feared themselves to be, cursed, diseased, or even evil. And yet, despite this overwhelming fear, they had no choice but to live on, to continue the cycle, because they were bound by the very genetics they had inherited. This isolation, compounded by their genetic condition, also led to an increased sense of hopelessness. For them, there were no answers, no solutions, no possibility of a cure, no medical intervention that could fix what had been broken long before they were born. In a world where genetics and heredity were still mysteries, they had no one to turn to for help. The family may have tried to find ways to cope with their fear, but as their condition worsened, it's likely that they became increasingly resigned to their fate. There was no escape from the slow, inevitable decline that genetics had handed them. As much as they may have hoped for a miracle or some divine intervention, the truth was far darker. They were prisoners of their own bloodline. Perhaps the most tragic element of their story, however, is that despite the horrors they faced, there was no one to help them. The family's isolation ensured that they were entirely cut off from any support system, any medical advancements, and any social structure that could offer them even a glimmer of hope. While others in the village might have been able to seek solace in their religious beliefs or in the support of family and friends, the family was left to suffer alone. The horror of their situation was not just the physical suffering they endured, but the emotional and psychological toll of being completely alone in a world that did not understand them. What is particularly heartbreaking is the fact that their suffering was, to a large extent, avoidable. If the family had known about the dangers of inbreeding, if they had been aware of the biological mechanisms that were working against them, perhaps they could have made different choices. But in the absence of this knowledge, they were doomed to repeat the same patterns, generation after generation, creating a legacy of fear and suffering that spanned centuries. The cycle of inbreeding that had begun with earlier generations had trapped them, binding them in ways that would be impossible to escape, even if they had wanted to. As the family continued their lives in silence, the myths surrounding them grew. They became more than just a family. They became a symbol, an embodiment of the darkest fears of the villagers and those who whispered their names in the shadows. The family of Alsace became more than just the sum of its parts. They became an untouchable, a warning to others of what could happen when the natural order was violated. They were the living proof of the dangers of genetic isolation, a family whose history was both a testament to human resilience and a cautionary tale of the catastrophic consequences of ignoring the laws of biology. Over time, the family's condition only worsened. The deformities grew more pronounced, the mental instability more evident, and the fear more ingrained. They were no longer just a family. They were a haunting, a reminder of a genetic error that had spiraled out of control. And as they continued to live in their isolated world, surrounded by their own fear and the whispers of the village, their story became more than just a tale of genetic decline. It became a dark parable, a symbol of how fear, ignorance, and isolation can converge to create something that is both tragic and terrifying in equal measure. The family's fate, sealed by their own bloodline, would echo through the generations, a chilling reminder of the price that was paid for the mistakes of the past. As the family's story continued to unfold, their situation became more dire, more tragic, and more intertwined with the dark tapestry of superstition that had become their reality. The isolation, both physical and psychological, began to take on an almost suffocating quality. Over time, the very house in which they lived, deep within the secluded reaches of Alsace, became a symbol of their imprisonment, not just in a physical sense, but in a far more existential one. They were trapped not only by their bloodline but by the relentless whispers of the outside world and the relentless effects of inbreeding, which seemed to haunt them like a ghost they could not escape. Every generation that passed brought with it more severe manifestations of genetic degradation, exacerbating their physical deformities, their mental instability, and the chilling sense that they were living in the aftermath of a decision made long before their time. What is perhaps most horrifying is that the family likely never had the opportunity to break free from the grip of their genetic fate. Inbreeding, though practiced in isolated communities for centuries, is not without its consequences. The risks are well documented today, but in the 17th century, knowledge of genetics was non-existent, and even the most basic understanding of heredity was shrouded in mystery. The family, thus, had no idea that they were perpetuating their own destruction with every new generation. They likely saw their condition as something cursed, something inexplicable that ran deeper than their mere physical flaws. They would have struggled not just with the painful reality of their own bodies, but with the crushing weight of their family's history and the seemingly unchangeable cycle of decline that they were trapped in. Over time, the family must have developed an acute sense of hopelessness. Each new birth may have been greeted with a mixture of hope and dread, hope that perhaps this child would be different, perhaps immune to the genetic flaws that had plagued the others, but dread, too, because they knew the odds. How could they not? They had seen the physical deformities appear in every generation, the mental breakdowns, the gradual unraveling of the very fabric that held their bloodline together. For the family, the act of raising a child became a profound existential struggle. To bring life into the world only to watch it deteriorate so rapidly would have been a source of unimaginable pain. Each new child would be born with the full weight of their family's tragic history on their shoulders, destined to inherit not just their deformities but the burden of a past they could never escape. And so, the family's fear grew.